Welcome to the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies Online. For more information about our programs, publications and membership, please visit our website, themuslimfaculty.org.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the 10th lecture in the Politics of Power course from the Civilization and Society program of the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies. The title of today's talk is From State to Market. Please make a note of questions that you want to ask, write them down, and we'll look at them after the talk, inshallah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in wa sallama taslima walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. I've spent rather more time in this lecture looking at foundational matters, and this was occasioned by my looking for the definition of state and the etymology of the word state. Now, the word state comes from a Latin verb which means to stand, and therefore gives the two meanings that we're used to, of the two noun meanings we're used to, which is the condition, the state that you're in, or the political organization of a body. The Peace of Westphalia of 1645 is regarded as the birth of the state, but is really the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire of the Habsburgs. Now we come to another term which relates to state, comes from the same root, which is estate. So before people talked much about the state, they talked about the estate, and they talked about the different estates of the society. With the Habsburgs, the first estate comprised the 7 electors who chose the emperor. The second estate comprised the other nobility who did not have the power of election, and the third estate comprised the heads of the 80 or so cities of the empire. So there's a difference, there's a transition from the idea of a state, as we saw at the Treaty or the Peace of Westphalia, to the idea of a nation state. The nation state is a state that self-identifies as deriving its political legitimacy from serving as a sovereign entity for a nation, as a sovereign territorial unit. The state is a political and geopolitical entity. The nation is a cultural and or ethnic entity. However, these two definitions imply that there is clarity and certainty where in fact there is none. And this is the basis of most of the political problems of the world. The French Revolution is largely the beginning of the nation state. The nation state, paradoxically, will lead to the idea of the nation and nationalism rather than the other way around. The 19th and 20th centuries become the centuries of the nation state, with every group on earth, including the Muslims, seeking its own nation. Because it is actually impossible to define a piece of land with only a single race, language, ethnicity, or religion, the foundation of a nation state is always preceded by or followed by the slaughter and or expulsion of inconvenient groups and minorities. The state thus shows its origins. Rather than being an evolution, it was originally the consequence of the breakup, in this case of the Habsburg Holy Roman Empire. Elsewhere, smaller entities such as the German principalities and dukedoms and the Italian city-states agglomerate, but larger entities such as the Osmanli Dawla are broken up. The colonial powers draw lines completely arbitrarily across maps, dividing some peoples, such as Arabia, the Emirates, Kuwait and Iraq, and dividing Sham into Syria, Lebanon, Jordan and Israel, and uniting completely unsympathetic tribes and peoples, such as in Iraq and the Sudan. Remembering that Sudan itself was cut out of what was known geographically as Bilad al-Sudan, which was the land of the black people, which extended from southern Egypt across Africa right the way to Nigeria. It wasn't a political entity, it was a geographical entity. So we've looked at the estates in the Habsburg times, and when we come to the revolution, prior to the revolution, the order of society divided also into estates. The first estate, the clergy, representing knowledge, piety, and to some extent banking. The second estate, the aristocracy, representing land, genetic heritage, and military power. And the third estate, the commoners, representing the rest, except that it is only the bourgeoisie who have a voice from the commoners. And so the French king will periodically through the ages summon the Estates Generales. There's groupings of these three, representatives of these three groups to voice their concerns and to advise the king. Each one of these estates represents a power. The clergy represent the very real power of knowledge. The nobility represent the very real power of genetic inheritance and hereditary ownership of land. The townspeople represent the very real power of numbers of men and sometimes money. At the time of the Revolution, the First Estate comprised 10,000 Catholic clergy and owned 5 to 10% of the lands in France, the highest per capita of any other estate. So even though it sounds like a small number, proportionately they owned more than the others. All property of the First Estate was tax exempt. The Second Estate comprised the nobility, which consisted of 400,000 persons at the time, including women and children. All is presided over by the king, who is there solely to hold all in balance. This is very important to grasp. The king is the fulcrum. He is the neutral point, the still point in all of this activity. Everyone else is out there for their own interests. The king alone looks to the interests of the whole and to the interests of each and every one. I'm speaking in ideal terms, not necessarily in terms of what was the practice. That is in times of peace. In times of external threat, then he must unite the estates around him and lead them in war. So the king is theoretically a servant. As in most societies, land is wealth, and it is the land that bears the brunt of the taxation. However, the landowners, the aristocrats, pass that on to the commoners. The clergy, as men of the cloth, and as scholars, of course have no money and thus need pay no tax, except that this is not true. The church is wealthy. The church owns very substantial amounts of land and property and money. However, in this rather idealistic picture of the pre-revolutionary times, there is a snake in paradise, and the snake is the money. For various reasons which no one understands, because very, very few people understand money, there is no money. Everyone is stretched. Therefore, the king does various things to try and resolve the issue, and because he does not understand money, he employs a Scotsman called John Law. Remember that everyone is enthralled by the new British experiment in parliamentary democracy and the new bourgeois trading culture brought about by the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the foundation of the Bank of England in 1694 and the issuance of the first national paper money, except that the bank is not a national institution but a private corporation granted certain rights by the state. So everybody's enthralled to this British model. King Louis King Louis XV's regent, Philippe d'Orléans, appointed John Law as Controller General of Finances. And he was inveigled by John Law into various unwise adventures, including the foundation of a trading company called the Mississippi Company, which was made liable for all the national debt. To cut a long and complex story short, John Law loved the new paper money of the British and was determined to bring it to the French. But he did what everyone has always done when given the license to print money. He printed far too much, and then suddenly everyone wanted their assets back, which they had exchanged for paper. There was a run on his bank, and everything collapsed very badly. It was from this collapse that the French government suffered badly for years, in fact for decades, because the king had guaranteed everything. Thus, a very nasty loan that didn't just stay still, but kept growing, festered, and no one knew what to do with it. And there was no way that the first estate, the clergy, or the second estate, the nobility, would have any part in paying anything. No, the third estate had to carry the burden, which understandably made them upset. All of this took many years, but the outcome was almost inevitable. And thus, in the Revolution, 2 estates vanished, with a great number of the third estate who even looked remotely sympathetic to the first and second estates, or who served their needs, tailors and perfumers, for example. And as Sheikh Abdul Qadir has shown in his book, the technique of the coup de banque, then it was also used as a period to slaughter a great many non-French speaking people. And remember, at this time, only half of what we call the French nation spoke French, and only a very few of them spoke it well. There's another body, and this could be misunderstood, and it's what's called the Fourth Estate. However, this is not a genuine estate, but it was a way of referring to something outside the ordinary functioning and order and hierarchy of the society, which nevertheless was beginning to wield power. And this refers to 2 bodies. The Fourth Estate is a societal or political force or institution whose influence is not consistently or officially recognized. Fourth Estate most commonly refers to the news media, especially print journalism or the press. Remember, journalism is from the French word jour, le jour, the day, meaning, so it is specifically a French concept. In 1580, Montaigne proposed that government should hold in check a fourth estate of lawyers, selling justice to the rich and denying it to rightful litigants who do not bribe their way to a verdict. So here's a second usage, both the usage referring to journalists and to lawyers. And so this, with the vanishing of estates, then these new states begin to come to the fore, and specifically now the lawyer class. The old order had gone, and so people were needed to devise a new order, and the lawyers seemed to be the logical choice, or at least they certainly chose themselves. Danton, Robespierre et al., down to our own day, and Nixon, Clinton, Blair, and how many more of the public figures with whom we're all familiar. In fact, there is a prior emergence of this force, and this is with a person such as Calvin. Calvin was a lawyer, and he was in at the inception of the Reformation, drew up a constitution for the city of Geneva, amusingly enough, to be a city of God, rather than the city of banking, which it then developed into. But the most elementary rule of law was forgotten. Law needs a sword to see that its judgments are carried out, and the sword had been in the hand of the king, and now there was no king. Lawyers rarely wield swords, or at least not very effectively. Thus the lawyers instead got a guillotine, but lacking the ordinary equanimity of people who know the sword, who know life and death, and are thus capable of some containment and restraint, the lawyers reacted hysterically. For example, as Carlyle describes Robespierre, he was the sea green incorruptible. He was incorruptible because he was an intellect with little interest in things that corrupt, such as wealth and women, and thus fatally lacking ordinary human sympathy for those who desire such things, in this case the great majority of humanity. He was sea green because when himself under any threat or in danger, he turned green from fear. So he's not a man of the sword. He's not a man, and he's very much the man who becomes hysterical, as did the entire French assembly throughout what is called La Terreur. Is that the correct pronunciation? La Terreur, the first terror. This man then casually sent many to their deaths for very trivial matters, until one day the guillotine called for him too. So a society run directly by lawyers was a bit too much. And as we saw, there's a need for the sword, and thus the times called for a strong man with a sword, and Napoleon obliged, and people were greatly relieved. In parallel with them, there was this other group we first mentioned who came to inherit the term Fourth Estate, and that was the journalists who had recorded every minute doing of the revolution as it happened, but very often had also incited it and provoked it. And how do we reconcile these two groups contending for the name the Fourth Estate? Well, they are both wordsmiths. If the clergy represented thought and knowledge, the Fourth Estate represented words and debate, language as a weapon. And classed with them, the philosophes. The philosophes were a very significant group in the lead up to the revolution. And among them you have a group called the Encyclopedists, who began to draw up the new Enlightenment knowledge in this encyclopedic way. So this is state. Now, looking at the word market, and looking at the root of it, it has got the sense of a meeting at a fixed time for buying and selling livestock and provisions. It has the sense of the gathering itself and then the place itself. It comes from a root, Italian mercato, and it goes back to the root which is to do with, which connects to merchant and merchandise. So here you have three very concrete images. You have the market is a gathering, and by extension the place where people gather. Who gathers? The merchants, and of course those who come to buy. What do they gather with? Merchandise. The images are very specific and concrete. So how do we get to the abstract and now slightly anthropomorphic concept of the market and market forces? Thus Carl Schmitt's insight is useful here. Nihilism is the separation of order and location. A marketplace was an order in a location. A market was an order in a location. It was a gathering of people in a marketplace. Today a market is an abstract anthropomorphic entity that governs the activities of people who never meet each other and never gather in a location. Later, market came to have the sense of sales as controlled by supply and demand. And this usage dates from the 1680s. So something was happening around this epoch, 1680 up to about 1690, and that is borne out by the fact we referred to earlier, which was the foundation a few years later of the Bank of England. There is some fundamental paradigm shift. This shift had, however, happened once before in another society. Ivan Illich says, Aristotle in the Politics observed something new and unheard of in Athens. Some citizen merchants were using a previously unknown technique when they offered their goods in the market. Instead of selling these goods at cost plus profit, or keeping to the values established by treaty with a foreign supplier, these innovators let the price vary according to offer and demand. Aristotle was fascinated that such a transaction could take place and wondered how it worked. Polanyi was the first to recognize this. Polanyi assembled a team of historians at Columbia University. Each studied a different society, trying to discover when prices first began to move according to supply and demand in ordinary times. All of them reported the same finding. The replacement of simple trade by this marketing technique, though practiced occasionally while being generally legally proscribed, was not part of the ordinary social life in any ancient society. Was not part of the ordinary social life in any ancient society. Furthermore, such an arrangement only became the form of common behavior at the time of Aristotle and after. Here, Ivan Illich says, I began to see the first lineaments of what is today called the economy, a system resting on scarcity. It is very difficult for people to grasp that their quotidian reality is a historical aberration. Not, that is, until it begins to hurt. The view of trade that says, let me see what I can get for this, is utterly different from the view that says, how much did this cost me and how much do I need to add on to that for myself? One of the fundamental transactions of the mu'amalat of the Sharia is called murabaha, defined by Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi thus. As for murabaha, it is that the owner of the goods acquaint the purchaser with how much he bought them for, and he takes a profit from him, whether in general, for example, when he says, I bought them for 10 and you will give me a dinar or 2 as profit. Or in detail, which is that he says, you will give me a dirham for every dinar. But this is yes. The Islamic banking fraternity have falsely used this term to cover mortgages and the like in the following manner. The customer first comes to the bank saying that he wants to buy such and such a house. The banker knows that if he makes a contract with the customer to buy the house on his behalf and to sell it to him at a profit, whether the payment is in installments or just deferred to a future date, that this is considered to be 2 sales in one sale, which by the consensus of the people of knowledge of all the madhabs is haram and usury. Thus, the bankers make use of the opinion of one Maliki scholar, that he alone held that if the purchaser promises to purchase the said house, that this is legally enforceable. And this is what the bank want. They want a contract that is enforceable. This is not entirely a digression, because this is the penetration of this banking mentality into the Muslim Ummah today. But we have gone ahead of ourselves. And we had looked at the various estates of the pre-revolutionary society, and one that is not properly speaking an estate comprised of the journalists and the lawyers, and another group had worked quietly in the background, as is their wont, while all around them laboured and fought. The bourgeoisie, or rather the moneyed class who had evolved out of the merchant class, who were themselves a part of the Third Estate. These were the people who had become enriched by the natural bounty of trade, but upon achieving their wealth, like mountain climbers who have set out to ascend a mountain only to discover that what they thought was the peak was only the top of the nearest foothill, the merchants, upon reaching wealth that others ordinarily only dream about, discovered the vistas of unlimited wealth extending far beyond their eyes, and that wealth was at first to be acquired by money lending. And thus banking was born, because in defiance of the prohibition of every religion of the act of lending at interest, the merchant, naturally enough, in their thinking, took to accepting a little something for the use of his capital sums, and saw his wealth begin to grow exponentially. And perhaps he gave some away to good causes, but not too much. And because the old estates had sunk into mayhem because of an unmanageable debt, the new order was not going to make the same mistake, and Napoleon quickly recognized a small group of wealthy men as the Bank of France. But remember, as in all such cases, although it sounded rather grand and national and patriotic, it was no more national than the local bakery or laundry. In other words, the Bank of France, as the earlier Bank of England and the later Federal Reserve, was a private company rather than an office of state. But this private company had a very important customer, the French nation, and indeed had a monopoly on that customer's affections. So now France had a sword again in the person of Napoleon, and everyone was glad. And the lawyers could carry on without the need to wield the sword. The estates were gone, and everyone was now a citoyen in the state, except that some of the citoyens are much more citoyens than others, as is always the case. But today it is bad-mannered to admit to it. And so the age of the nation-state is born. And what a different cast of characters. What estates. In some way, the first estate re-emerged, but stripped of religion, and is now academia. And in that realm, people of every, but mostly no religion, all mix freely. The second estate, the landed nobility, survived too, but the personages changed. And there are plenty of the third estate, but what different people they are. Yet something has decidedly changed, and that is the banker. But the human story has had bankers already for a very substantial part of its history, and this is something even more significant that happens here, and this is the central banker. We have the central bank and the central banker. England got its central bank in 1694 in a deal with a group of men to fund William's war against France. France got its in 1800. At that date, financial power was in the hands of about 10 or 15 private banking houses whose founders, in most cases, had come from Switzerland in the second half of the 18th century. And this connects back to our mention of Calvin, Geneva, Protestantism, which is the deep story of this rise of banking. These bankers, all Protestant, were deeply involved in the agitations leading up to the French Revolution. When the revolutionary violence got out of hand, they were the chief forces behind the rise of Napoleon, whom they regarded as the restorer of order. As a reward for this support, Napoleon in 1800 gave these bankers a monopoly over French financial life by allowing them to control the new Bank of France. Banks took people's deposits, looking at how banks work. Originally their gold and their silver, and issued receipts for them. People began to use the receipts as money. It then became obvious to the bankers that they could write more receipts than they had gold and silver to cover. The only risk here was that a large number of the depositors would want their gold and silver back at the same time, as frequently happened, leading to financial collapse. Rather than admit to the fundamentally deceptive nature of this transaction, bankers devised the idea of the central bank, which would hold a percentage of ordinary banks' deposits for just such emergencies. This was all well and good as long as the run on the bank was limited to one bank. But when, as happened, confidence in banking itself was shaken, then even the central bank's deposits were not enough. Again, rather than admit to the inherent deception in the systems, bankers would go on to invent global central banks. Of course, this merely defers the day of reckoning and permits the possibility of global meltdown with horrendous possibilities, as we are beginning to witness and to envision for the future. Now, the lawyers had a very fundamental contribution to all of this, and they give us some of the key forms that determine this next phase. And these forms are the corporation, the bankruptcy laws, and limited liability laws. In England, the first recognised piece of bankruptcy legislation was the Statute of Bankrupts in 1542, which, if I remember correctly, was during the reign of Henry VIII. And this was the very first time that usury was permitted by a statute of an English Act of Parliament. And then later there was the Bankrupts Act of 1705. Because debt had now become potentially unpayable, since the grand sum of debt in general always exceeds the sum of wealth because of the invention of money from nothing, then it was necessary to introduce legislation that allowed people to some extent to walk away from their debts. Otherwise, business failure would incapacitate too many, and that would deter many from the life of trade with catastrophic consequences. Limited liability allows that the businessman is only responsible for a specified maximum amount in the case of bankruptcy. The corporation. Although the corporation has solid foundations in Roman law and there were corporate entities throughout the medieval period, the modern corporation comes into being during the time of colonial expansion in the 17th century, this pre-French Revolutionary epoch we've been looking at. The true progenitors of the modern corporation emerged as the chartered company. Acting under a charter sanctioned by the Dutch government, the Dutch East India Company defeated Portuguese forces and established itself in the Moluccan Islands in order to profit from the European demand for spices. Investors in the Dutch East India Company were issued paper certificates as proof of share ownership and were able to trade their shares on the original Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Shareholders are also explicitly granted limited liability in the company's royal charter. The essence of the corporation is that it is regarded as a person with rights and liabilities, but the consequence of that is something quite opposite. The shareholders, although retaining rights, no longer have the onerous responsibilities and liabilities that ordinarily they would have had. Thus, shareholders to some extent can evade their actual moral responsibilities and their financial liabilities. Of course, among the first corporations are the state itself and municipal bodies, then universities, etc. Note that here we are not talking about corporations in the almost anthropomorphic form fashionable among the left wing who denigrate Microsoft or BP or IBM, for example, because corporations comprise millions of people and indirectly and directly involve many, many millions more. And when we realize that the nation states are themselves corporate entities, then that we have to accept that they are us. For we are all members of corporate bodies for which we accept no responsibility. And banks are special cases of corporations. When we see the evasion of responsibility by shareholders and the assumption of responsibility by abstract bodies, then we begin to get a clue to the workings of the world. People we do not know buy and sell the ownership of abstract entities such as Apple Computers and IBM on a daily basis. We see a visible form, but the actual power and wealth movers are invisible except to students of this area. To understand stocks and shares, we have to understand what they replaced, which was the partnership, a body of people having the ownership of a body and responsibility and liability for it. Later, then, people came to buy parts of corporate entities, sometimes for as little as parts of a nanosecond, from which shares they derive benefit and for which they have no responsibility or liability. Thus we have seen the collapse of an old order and the emergence of a new corporate form, the state, the bank, etc., in which the lawyer steps to the front. He crafts the legal forms, and litigation is the sine qua non of commercial life today, and the owners retreat into the shadows. And it is fair enough to say that with the creation of the central banks, the state itself becomes a bank in many ways, even though in some cases the central bank is still a private body owned by the other banks, or in cases such as the British Bank, the Bank of England, it is owned theoretically by the nation. So that is the completion of today's lecture. There's a great deal of detail that could have been there, but it was impossible within the constraints of the lecture to do that. Thank you for your attention. Assalamu alaikum.